Hi, in this video we will talk about sampling and recruitment of research participants. And sampling simply means selection. So sampling is about how you select the people, organizations, texts, social situations, or time periods that will be part of your research. How do you select the people you will interview, the people you will observe, who will be part of your research? That's sampling. And in order to understand how sampling is done in qualitative research, which is the focus in our course, we will start by having a brief look at sampling in quantitative research. And please note that this is a very simplified explanation. It's much more complex in reality. I don't have time to go into details, but I hope it's useful in order to understand that sampling in qualitative research is based on a rather different logic than sampling in quantitative research. Because in quantitative research, sampling is based on probability sampling. And that means that you sample in a way that the sample has been selected using random selection, so that each unit in the population has a known probability of being selected. Let's imagine, looking at this figure here, that the population, that's the universe of units from which the sample is to be selected. The population is within the blue circle here. Each cross, we can say that each cross represents a text, a person, a social setting where you can observe. And the sample, or the population, is then all the crosses or all the people located within the blue circle constitute your population. Let's say master's students at MF. The sample is then the segment of population that you select to do your study. In the figure, the sample is within the red circle. And done correctly, probability sampling will result in a representative sample, a sample that reflects the population accurately, so that it can be said to be a microcosm of the population. For instance, within the blue circle, half of the crosses are green. Within the red circle, half of the crosses are also green. If you're doing probability sampling in terms of master's students, you might want to have the same proportion of female and male students, the same proportion of students with different kinds of backgrounds. Depending on the focus of your research, you want to make sure that your sample reflects the population that it's drawn from, because that will help you to have a representative sample, which is important if you want to be able to generalize statistically from the sample to a larger population, which, as we've talked about in a previous video, is often a central objective in quantitative research. In qualitative research, sampling works quite differently. That's also because the research objectives are different. And the type of sampling we use in qualitative research is called non-probability sampling. That means that individuals, social settings, text are selected randomly, and chosen on purpose. And for this reason, we often talk about purposive sampling in qualitative research. Another term used is criterion-based sampling, because the sample units you analyze are selected using certain criteria. And such sampling criteria can be age, gender, occupation, or that your research participant should have specific experiences or role. It all depends on your research questions. So it's your research questions that defines who will be relevant or what will be relevant as your sample. And in the method section of your project in a thesis, that's the method chapter, you have to specify which criteria you used for sampling. And sometimes these criteria are so obvious that you might not even think about it as criteria. If you're doing a study on master's students and you want to interview them about their experience of writing a thesis, of course, one important criteria is that the people you interview are actually master's students and not teachers or random strangers you meet on the street. So that could be one criteria, but you might also have other criteria depending on the focus of your research or your research question, which specifies that focus. Students often wonder about sample size in qualitative research. How many people do I need to interview? How many times do I need to observe? How many texts do I need to analyze in order to have the data I need for my thesis? It's very difficult to give one single answer to that question because it depends on a large number of factors. It depends on your research question, which will communicate the focus of your research. It depends on your choice of research method, and especially whether you are using one method or several methods. If you're using several methods, you might not be able to interview as many people or do as many observations do as much observation as you would if you were only using one method. It depends on your sampling criteria. The more criteria you use, the larger sample you might need to have in order to cover different criteria. And it depends on your time and resources, which often is related to the scope of the research project. We would expect a larger sample in a thesis that you spend a year preparing than in a thesis where you only had one semester. I encourage you, if you're unsure about sample size and what would be an appropriate sample size, I encourage you to look at the sample size used in previous master theses and also ask your supervisor for advice, and to think, not to think that you should do as many interviews as possible or analyze as many texts as possible or do as much observation as possible, because you also have to think about that you need quite a lot of time to actually analyze the data that you have collected. And more data does not necessarily make it easier to analyze the data. On the contrary. At the same time, of course, you need usually more than just one interview. But it could be enough just to analyze one text. Not if the text is only 1 page long, but sometimes you're analyzing a larger document, then one text is more than enough to write a master thesis on. So it really depends on your specific research project. Lastly, in this video, I want to say something about how to recruit research participants, because there are some tricks here and some key terms that you should be familiar with. One way of recruiting research participants is to start by going through lists of potential informants or potential research participants. This is maybe not so relevant for recruiting specific individuals, because you might not have access to these lists or they might not exist, but it could be relevant if you're looking for an organization, a congregation, a school. You might be able to find lists, and then you can look at these lists to help you decide where to start contacting people. Often in qualitative research, researchers use a gatekeeper to recruit research participants. A gatekeeper is a person or several individuals who have connections to the group you wish to get in contact with. It could be a teacher if you wish to do research on pupils. It could be a boss or leader in an organization, or it can be someone who works in an organization working with a specific group of people that you are interested in doing research on. And this gatekeeper can be used as a bridge between you as the researcher and the research participants. They can give you permission to put up a poster about your research, informing about your research project during a meeting, or they can help you more directly by selecting or suggesting people that you could interview, or certain places or settings where you can observe and help you get in touch with them. And gatekeepers are often used in qualitative research, but you should be aware of some potential challenges involved in using a gatekeeper, because the gatekeeper can influence or will influence who you get in touch with. And by influencing who you get in touch with, who you interview or where you observe, or what kind of texts you read, they will also influence what kind of perspectives and experiences or you get access to, and influence the conclusions you arrive at in your thesis. You can also risk, especially if you're doing interviews or observation, that you become associated with the gatekeeper. This can be both positive and negative for you. It can open doors for you, but it can also close doors depending on the relationships between your research participants and the gatekeeper. And you can risk that people feel pressure to participate in the research project, that they are less honest because they're afraid that you will share some information with the gatekeeper. There's a lot of dynamics, interpersonal dynamics, that you are entering into when you're using a gatekeeper. Sometimes you cannot avoid using a gatekeeper, but you should think about the potential consequences. And if there's any negative consequences, think about how you can avoid them or how you can try to reduce these negative consequences. And discuss and reflect upon these consequences in the methods section. Lastly, another strategy used to recruit research participants is what is often called snowballing. It simply means that you start by interviewing one person, and then you ask that person if they know someone who is in a similar situation, is part of a similar group, shares the similar characteristics or experiences, or in other words, people who fulfill the criteria that you have set down for being included in your sample. And snowballing can be useful when it's difficult to recruit research participants. But you should also think about that when you use snowballing, there's a danger that your research participants will all be part of the same social network. If one person leads you to a second person, and that second person leads you to the third person, etc., maybe these people all know each other, and therefore they have the same experiences and thoughts, but they are not necessarily representative of, or they don't, well, the aim in qualitative research is not that they should be representative, but maybe there's some experiences that you miss out on because all these people have a similar background and experience things in a similar way. So you might want to have several snowballs rolling in order to be able to access slightly different individuals within the group that you're doing research on. So these were some key terms and some information regarding sampling and recruitment of research participants.